Welcome. For this KCEP research summary, the questions we considered were: is there a group of students with low KCEP ratings who later get back onto a more positive academic trajectory? And if so, how do these students compare with their peers? This table shows how we examine this topic by identifying three groups of students based on their KCEP ratings and their reading fluency at the end of grade 2. The continuous risk students had low KCEP ratings at kindergarten entrance and continued to be at risk as shown by the number of words per minute they read at the end of grade 2. The closing the gap students were the group that we were particularly interested in. These students also had low KCEP ratings at kindergarten entrance. However, they made academic gains and by the spring of grade 2 were reading at or above grade level standards. The proficient group of students were rated as academic ready to go at kindergarten entry and remained proficient in the spring of grade 2 on their reading fluency assessments. What follows is a description of these three groups of students based on information we collected at the beginning of grade 4. To answer our questions, both past and present student data were collected. Past data included academic data from kindergarten through grade 4, and student demographic data were obtained from school district databases. Present data were collected during individual student interviews and rating forms completed by teachers. The first objective was designed to identify if the closing the gap students had substantially caught up by grade 4. For this project, closing the gap was defined as scoring in the same range as the proficient students on standardized assessments that measured cognitive and achievement abilities. It was presumed that if students scored in the same range, then their academic skills would also be in the same range. We found that there was no difference between the closing the gap and proficient students on reading fluency as measured by the DIBELS in grade 4. Student scores on standardized cognitive assessments were also compared. We found no difference between the closing the gap and proficient students on verbal cognitive tasks, and both groups had significantly higher scores than the continuous risk group. In addition, there were no significant differences among the groups on nonverbal cognitive abilities. In other words, language skill differences were related to how students were making gains towards closing the achievement gap. There were no differences on nonverbal cognitive skills. After getting these initial findings, we followed up to see how the closing the gap students compared with the continuous risk students and how they were similar to proficient students. We looked at kindergarten data, and we found that overall these groups were more similar than they were different. The continuous risk students qualified for free lunch services at the highest rate, indicating a socioeconomic risk influence. Proficient students were more likely to have attended preschool, which may have served as a protective factor against other risk factors, such as lower parent education. Finally, the proficient students were at an academic advantage at kindergarten entry because they had fewer total risks than the continuous risk and the closing the gap students. We compared the students' California Standard Test, or CST, results in grades 2 and 3. We speculated that the students in the closing the gap group would score in the same range as the proficient students, and the continuous risk students would score significantly lower. However, we did not find this to be the case. Instead, we found that the more proficient students had higher CST scores than the closing the gap students. However, the closing the gap students had better CST scores than the continuous risk students. We then looked at the grade 3 CST results. We found that the grade 3 CST scores were similar to the grade 2 CST scores. The proficient students scored higher than the closing the gap students, who scored higher than the continuous risk group. Students in the closing the gap and proficient groups had similar cognitive abilities and academic abilities, but the students in the proficient group gained more academic skills that were consistent with the state's standards. It is possible that the closing the gap students were in the process of catching up with their more proficient peers in the earlier grades. They missed some core academic content. This demonstrates the essential need for early intervention and highlights that closing the gap is a long-term process. Overall, this look at the KCEP groups highlighted that students in the closing the gap and proficient groups have similar cognitive and achievement abilities at grade 4. However, these scores did not always translate into academic proficiency. This is shown in the grade 2 and grade 3 CST assessments, where the proficient students did better than the closing the gap students. Other significant differences found between the groups were qualification for free lunch. Students who qualify for free lunch were most likely to be in the continuous risk group. A notable finding was that a majority of the students who attended preschool in this study were in the proficient group. This highlights that preschool acts as a protective factor for students who have other academic risk factors and may help put students on track for academic success. Lastly, it was found that students in the proficient and closing the gap groups developed their English language skills at a faster rate than the continuous risk students. We see several implications. The association of preschool as protective factor stresses the need for students to attend preschool and gain early academic experiences. This information also stresses the importance of kindergarten screening and academic follow-up. If a student enters school with multiple risk factors, it is important to provide immediate follow-up interventions and monitor the student's academic progress. Language development should also be monitored, and additional support should be given to students who are not making significant academic progress. Finally, CST information shows that closing the gap is a long-term process. For this reason, academic progress should be monitored even when the student appears to have caught up, because the students may still have skill deficits that impede their long-term academic success. For more detailed information about the KCEP, please visit our website or send us an email. Thank you.